So, hello everyone, thank you for joining us today. My name is Sarah and I normally see you at the Museum of Zoology, where I work in the public engagement team. I am very pleased to welcome you to a very special bonus interview. This video follows a 4-week course of speakers from the Department and Museum of Zoology, where we explore the animal kingdom and real conservation stories together each week. I'm joined today by my colleague Darron Cullen. He is in the Museum of Zoology Gallery. Darron is a visiting researcher in the Department of Zoology and works with insects. Today, he's going to introduce us to an insect that changes colour as it develops. Hi, Darron.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm sure that our audience will also be wondering why you are holding a pumpkin.
It's a good question. Well, I thought that because I want to talk today about pigments and coloration, it'd be a good place to start with something very familiar, especially at this time of year, because it's Halloween, and I'm sure you've all seen plenty of these in the shops. So this is obviously a pumpkin, and the thing that gives the pumpkin its very vivid orange color is a pigment called carotene. And I'm interested in carotenes because of how insects use them to signal to one another. It's also the kind of pigment that the flamingo uses to signal to its partners that it's been very good at feeding, and the flamingo gets its color from its diet, and eventually down the food chain it winds up with plants like the pumpkin. So pumpkins, carrots, tomatoes, corn, anything that you can think of from your dinner table that's been grown in a field and has bright oranges, yellows and reds, those colors are almost always given by pigments called carotenes.
So where else might we find carotene?
So we find carotenes in just about all plants. You don't always see them because sometimes they're obscured by the green coloration that is predominant in plants, but the carotenes are normally there. In fact, again, at this time of year, we'll start to see all the leaves change in color from green as the green pigments, the chlorophyll, start to break down. And what they leave behind are those really vivid yellows, oranges, and reds. And those are all carotenes that are left behind in the leaves. So those really nice autumnal colors we know, that's all thanks to carotenes. Just like this.
Excellent. So it was my understanding that you work with insects. Why are you in front of the bird specimens?
Well, I do work with insects, but what I'm interested in general is how animals signal to one another and how those signals have evolved over time. And an interesting example is the flamingo, because the flamingo doesn't make its own color. The color is, again, a carotene that comes from its diet. So the flamingos feed on krill, which are small arthropods that live in the water, small crustaceans. And those crustaceans, in turn, feed on algae, which are small aquatic plants. And those small aquatic plants are the ones that make the carotenes. So the krill accumulate the carotenes and the color. And the successful flamingos are the ones that can eat a lot of krill and, in turn, change that bright color. And so the more successful the flamingo is at feeding, the brighter its pink or orange coloration becomes. So it becomes a really important signal for mating that a successful flamingo is a brightly colored one.
Mm-hmm. So flamingos will be looking for a bright pink mate.
That's right, there they will be. And the same applies to lots of birds. If you can think of lots of birds, maybe even from this country, even things like the robin redbreast that starts to become very famous again at this time of year because it's a very Christmassy bird. That bright red coloration, again, is due to a carotene. And so the brighter the color, the more successful that bird has been at feeding and foraging and fighting for its territory. And that's the kind of thing that other birds look for when they're looking for a mate.
Fantastic. So Darron has some live insects to show us today, and we're just going to move to the museum learning lab where the insects are waiting for us. So welcome back. Darron is now in the museum learning lab where the live insects were waiting for us. Darron, what have you got for us today?
Well, I have some desert locusts, and there you can see some of them wandering around inside their tank. And I also have just the one here that might be easier to see. If I put that color up, you can see that it's quite a nice bright yellow color. So desert locusts are a type of grasshopper. All locusts, in fact, are types of grasshopper, but they're grasshoppers that have a particular ability to change their behavior according to the environment. So they don't always swarm, and they're not always a problem, but sometimes when the conditions bring lots of them together in one place, they start to actively move together and stay together in a group. And when they do that in large numbers, they can move over a landscape and very quickly eat their way across a huge amount of agricultural land. So that's why they can become a problem.
So locusts are, as you say, known for swarming, for eating lots of crops. Why do they make good study specimens?
Well, so we've had locusts here in Cambridge for maybe 100 years in the building. And the reason that we've used them is because they're a nice large insect. So you can see it's nearly the size of my finger. Mm-hmm. And I'll put that there again so you can see them. And they're large insects. They've got a very clear nervous system and large muscles. We've been looked at for things like flight and investigations into other forms of locomotion like jumping. You can see their big back legs that they have, being a grasshopper. They've been looked at for their vision. You can see those big eyes they've got at the front of their head. So they are a very important model or have been a very important model over the years for studies in physiology. But the reason I study them is because I'm interested in their color. So as you can see, this male is a nice bright yellow color. Whereas if I take a female, like this one, then when I compare them, whoops, they have a tendency to jump, being a grasshopper. There we go. The female is quite a dull sand color. And that's probably because when she comes to lay her eggs, she wants to be camouflaged against the sand, whereas the male is a much brighter yellow color. So hopefully you can see the difference there. Now, we've known about this difference in their color for some years, in fact, nearly 100 years, but we've not known why that is the case. We think we've always thought that females are this sand color for camouflage, but why the males go this bright yellow, we don't know. In fact, what I've done recently is just start to investigate this using some genetic techniques. So what I did was remove the yellow color from the males, and when you put them all together, they start to mate each other, thinking that they're female. So I think that it's probably a sexual recognition signal, which the males make in a swarm.
So this coloration, the extra yellow color in their exoskeleton, that's created by something we were talking about earlier on in the museum gallery called carotene. So we find that in pumpkins, in flamingos, and also in locusts. Why do we think that they create or become this yellow color in a swarm, as opposed to, do they become yellow when they're not in a swarm?
No, when they're on their own. So if you rear locusts in a cage on their own individually, they won't go this bright yellow color. And that's probably because it's a very conspicuous color to make. It's a very bright color, and they're likely to be seen on their own by predators like birds. And so it probably isn't a very good idea to be a bright color. But when you're in a swarm and there's lots and lots of you and you can take safety in numbers, then the chances of you being predated are quite low because you're one of a huge number of individuals, maybe billions and billions of locusts. So then your priorities change to wanting to be able to be distinguished from females so that you can easily mate with females in a swarm and avoid being jumped on by other males. So I think that this is a color that develops just in males as a way to prevent unwanted attention when they're in a swarm, but it's not a good color to be when you're on your own, so they don't do it.
So flamingos get their pink coloration from their food. Is that the same for locusts?
It is. Locusts always eat something green. They're grasshoppers, and so they normally eat grasses or sometimes broadleaf plants as well. So one of the things we like feeding them with in the lab, because it's easy, is kale, but they'll also eat cabbage, and they'll eat carrot as well. They tend to prefer things that are green in colour, and even though the green of this is the dominant pigment is the chlorophyll, much like the autumnal leaves, where the chlorophyll will eventually fade away, leaving behind the oranges and yellows, those are the carotenes. And those are the things that these guys are taking out of their food and putting into proteins and sticking into their own exoskeleton.
Is it a choice they're making, the males, to turn yellow when they're in a swarm? How does the body know to turn yellow?
It's a very good question, and we don't really know what it is about other locusts that makes them do it, but it seems to be automatic. So if you put males that have been on their own their whole lives and they're sexually mature, but they're not yellow, and you stick them together in a group, then within a couple of days, they'll all be bright yellow. So it just happens. But whether it's the smell of each other or the sight of each other or bumping into each other that causes that particular change, we're not sure yet. It's one of the small questions that we still have to answer on this. And equally, why it is that females don't go yellow when the males do is something, again, we're not sure how that's controlled.
So do we have any locusts in the UK?
We have them in the pet shops because, as you'll see, people probably will be familiar that if you go into a pet shop, you sometimes find mealworms and crickets and locusts for people to feed to things like lizards. And if you ever see locusts in a pet shop in the UK, then it will be this species, the desert locust. I'll show you that guy one more time. So these will be the ones that you'll often find in the pet stores. But in terms of wild ones, sometimes if there's a really big swarm in North Africa and the prevailing winds come northward, then they can blow a few into the UK. It has been recorded, but they don't normally last very long because the UK isn't warm enough for them. They're a desert species, and they like it to be 30 degrees plus, and we don't have very many days like that in the UK. And we certainly don't have winters like that. So they will die off very quickly when they get here, but it has been known. It's been recorded several times.
Wow, that's a very long way for them to be blown towards us.
It is. In fact, they will swarm. Sometimes the swarms get taken up so high into the stratosphere that they've made it all the way across the Atlantic from Africa to America. And when they've reached America, they have found different habitats because it's not quite as barren or desert-like in parts of the United States. And when they've reached that continent, they've evolved into a different species of grasshopper completely, which sometimes has a swarming behavior and sometimes doesn't. So they can make it a long, long way in their swarms.
Wow. So one last question for you. Locusts are generally disliked by people. Why do we dislike locusts and other species like species of grasshopper don't have the same negative reputation?
Well, at the moment, the desert locust is undergoing its biggest plague for a generation, and there are swarms of them right the way across the Middle East, parts of Central Africa and North Africa, and then stretching right the way across even as far as India. So it's maybe affecting up to 10% of the world's human population. So that's a lot of people whose livelihoods are affected by this outbreaking species. The thing about locusts that makes them difficult to deal with is that they don't do the same thing every year or every season. So they probably only swarm in any real numbers every few years. And certainly the swarm we're seeing at the moment is the biggest we've seen in 30 or 40 years. And obviously COVID being a particular problem at the moment means that they're not being dealt with as well as they may have been in a normal year. But because they're unpredictable, it means that governments find it very difficult to find the right amount of funding to allocate to them, because they might not want to give lots of funding to locusts if they don't swarm that year or the following year or even the following year. But so when locusts do swarm, it tends to take politicians by surprise. And in the meantime, they've done a lot of damage by the time they've been controlled. So I think it's their unpredictability that makes them very unpopular. But in the lab, they're very engaging animals to work with, and particularly things like their color and behavior, very easy to look at in an animal like this. So I've always been very fond of them.
So thank you very much for your time today, Darron.
Thanks, Sarah.